Happy Sabbath. Tonight we'll study the second part of chapter 17 of Revelation. I'm going to do a little recap because oftentimes I don't explain things clearly. Chapter 15 and 16 shows us the consequence of the world when they reject God's law and his plan of salvation. And it describes those who have destroyed the earth will experience their own destruction at the end. And the high point of the seventh plague is the Battle of Armageddon. And this battle is not political or military battle, but rather a theological and spiritual one, as we have mentioned before. And the Greek prostitute that John saw is the end-time Babylon, also called Babylon the Great. And this Babylon the Great is a short-lived coalition of dragon, the sea beast, and the false prophet. At the end time, they will join together to deceive the world and to force the world to worship this religious system. The great prostitute said to have daughters. And who are they? They are the world's religious powers that will unite with this satanic threesome to become a religious confederacy at the closing time. And this great prostitute said to sit on many waters. The waters denotes civil, secular, and political world powers. So that means Babylon, the end-time Babylon, this religious power will be supported by world secular powers at the end time. So that means that history will repeat itself again, just like in the Middle Ages. Two groups of people will be affected by this great prostitute. The first group, the kings of the earth. These are the governing political world powers. And the second one is those who dwell on the earth. And this denotes the general populace. They are not leaders. They are deceived, both of this group, because they put themselves under the control of the prostitute for political and economic gain. And then John was carried by the angel to the wilderness. And he was appalled when he saw the women in red and purple. And the head has an inscription, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. This woman with red and purple holds a golden cup and sitting on the scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. You just picture that scene. Her appearance demonstrates that she symbolizes a religious system because in the Old Testament, the priests are dressed in red and purple, and they also have inscription on the headdress, but the inscription is not like this prostitute's inscription. On the priest's forehead, it says, "Holiness unto the Lord." Although this woman appears in religious garb, this Babylon is a prostitute and the mother of prostitutes, according to this chapter. And she seduced the world to get away or to stray away from God. And John, the verse mentioned that he is astonished. Actually, in some version, it translates that he was appalled. And his reaction denotes he recognizes prostitute. He sees her in the wilderness in this chapter 17, but he recognizes her because she was the other woman earlier in history. It's mentioned in chapter 12. And this previous women fled into the wilderness because the red dragon was persecuting her. And we mentioned before that she was in the wilderness for 1260 years. And this explained why that John was appalled, because he has seen her before. So this explains why in chapter 12 verse 17 that the dragon at the end was very angry, but instead of chasing after the women, he is chasing after the offspring of the women. So what does that mean? That means that the church in the past that was faithful to God's will at the time of the end turned into an enemy of God's faithful remnant. And those who keep God's commandment and have the testimony of Jesus. Now we continue with chapter 17, starting verse 7. And the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will show you the mystery of the women and of the beast which carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns." Verse 8. The beast which you saw was, and is not, and is about to come out of the abyss. He departs into destruction, and those dwelling on the earth, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel, seeing the beast, because he was, and is not, and will come. Let us unpack these symbols. The beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Who can this be? In chapter 12, it was the red dragon that has 7 heads and 10 horns who pursued the women to the wilderness. In chapter 13, it was the sea beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, full of blasphemies against God and his people. This 7-head, 10-horn character again appeared in chapter 17. And this time, it is described as a scarlet beast with a prostitute sitting on it. And this suggests that this is a continuation of the religious system that had persecuted saints in the history. It was inactive for a while and will be again active and playing the key role in the Battle of Armageddon. The beast was and is not. What does that mean? This is a description of the scarlet beast. The expression was and is not was very popular in ancient time. It was used in memory of someone who lived but no longer lives. Thus, the scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns has 3 faces: in the past, present, and future, because it says the beast was and is not and is to come, right? So it has 3 faces: the past, the present, and the future. It points more likely to the sea beast with 7 heads and 10 horns in Revelation 13. Remember that one of its heads was wounded to the point of death, and the beast temporarily disappeared on the scene because of his wound, and yet he survives. And then in the future, it will return after his mortal wound has been healed. And he will appear again before the time of the end in renewed fury against God. What about a beast? Well, a beast, it is a description in both Old Testament and New Testament of a dark and chaotic prison for the fallen angel, the demons, and all the bad elements. So that suggests that the beast is demonic origin. How about those dwelling on the earth, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world? So these group are the non-believer, or we call them the wicked. So in Revelation, whenever they mention those who dwell on the earth are the non-believers. Also, these group of people, their name will not be in the book of life. And these people were astonished when they observed the activities of this familiar religious system. Now let's move on to verse 9. Here is the mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is sitting, and they are 7 kings. Verse 10. 5 have fallen, 1 is, another has not yet come, and when he comes, it is necessary for him to remain a little while. Well, this verse said, here is the mind with wisdom, means those who are wise shall understand. It is not referred to a brilliant mental intellectual ability to dissect symbols, but this wisdom is a divine attribute. Only through this divinely attribute would impart wisdom for those who tries to understand the meaning of this. 7 mountains. And the Greek word for 7 mountains is oros. It means mountain and not hills, because some translator believes this oros refers to hills because Rome has 7 hills. But according to Dr. Stefanovic, the context doesn't indicate Rome here. It is because John immediately explains that the mountain on which the prostitute sits are used metaphorically for 7 kings. And in Old Testament, kings usually means kingdoms or empire, but never as a symbol of an individual ruler. The explanation of the kings as 5 have fallen, 1 is, another one has not yet come, denotes these mountains and 7 heads are a succession of empires, according to the scholar called George E. Ladd. So this verse is pointing out that the great prostitute is a system of satanic deceptive power that has controlled successive empires. 7 kings, with the previous reasoning that kings denotes empires, and that these empires are being controlled by satanic power to hurt God's people, scholars concluded that these kings or empires are Egypt, the world power that oppressed Israel; Assyria, it was responsible for destroying the northern kingdom of Israel; Babylon, it destroyed Jerusalem and took the people of Judah into exile; Middle Persia, in the days of Queen Esther, the Jews were almost annihilated by these people; Greece, through Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jewish people were oppressed. He even attempted to destroy their religion. So these 5 that had oppressed God's people have fallen. And John is in the period of 1 is, which is the 6th power, the imperial Rome. And you remember, imperial Rome killed Jesus and persecuted Christians. to remain a little while denotes that the seventh power, which is in the future, will only have limited time to work its work because of the impending judgment on him. Now, verse 11. And regarding the beast which was and is not, he himself is an eighth, and is one of the seven, and departs into destruction. The beast was and is not. I mentioned that this expression was very popular in ancient time, denotes in memory of someone who lived but no longer lives. So this is pointing to the scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, who was the religious system that actively persecuting God's people in the past, and later became inactive because it has a mortal wound. Remember that? But then at the end, it will be playing a key role in persecuting the saints again. And this power is an eighth and is one of the 7. So the 7th kingdom, to come from John's perspective, refer to medieval ecclesiastical Christian, or we can say the papal power, and symbolically also represented by the sea beast who was mortally wounded, I just mentioned. And the 8th kingdom refers to the healing of this 7th power, the mortal wound being healed. That would be towards the end of this earth. Verse 12. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast in 1 hour. The angel had explained the 7 heads. Now he explains that the 10 horns are 10 kings. And who are these 10 kings? The 10 kings can best be understood under this context, means totality. 10 is a complete number, totality. So it's the totality of the powers of all nations on the earth, which are to be made subservient to this religious system, to go against Christ and his people, according to a scholar named Espen Beckwith. 1 hour. So this 10 kings, or this united power, will emerge at the very end of the time to join this religious system, but only for 1 hour, denotes a very short time. Verse 13. They are of one mind, and they give the power and authority to the beast. So these kings and anti-unity of governing political powers of the world collectively have one purpose: to submit their allegiance to this religious system and enforce its plan to go against God and his people. Verse 14. They will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and elect and faithful. The Lamb, this is Christ. He is Lord of lords and King of kings. And this combination of religious and secular power will have a showdown against Christ and his faithful followers. Please remember that the final battle is theological rather than political, right? It is spiritual rather than military battle. Verse 15. And he, which is the angel, said to me, the waters which you saw where the prostitute is sitting are people and multitudes and nations and tongues. Verse 16. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, they will hate the prostitute and make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. The angel now explains to John that the waters upon which the end-time Babylon sits on, which is river Euphrates, denotes or point to peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Water in Old Testament frequently denotes enemies of God's people. You can look at Psalms 18:4, Psalms 124, 2-5, Isaiah chapter 8, 7-8, and Jeremiah 47, 1 and 2. So the prostitute sits on the water symbolize this end-time religious system will dominate the governing secular and political power of the world. But this popular support will last only a short time, because in the final stage, the picture will suddenly and dramatically change. The drunken prostitute's lover, the 10 horns, and the beasts that have loyally supported Babylon now awaken from their drunkenness and will turn against their mistress. The language here echoes closely of Jeremiah's prophecy concerning the faithless Jerusalem. He said in Jeremiah 4:30, he said, "And you, O desolate one, what will you do? Although you dress in scarlet, although you decorate yourself with ornaments of gold, your lovers despise you. They seek your life." Wow. Jeremiah, in thousands of years before this, already predicted the very power that have up to this point loyally supported Babylon now withdraw the support and turn against her. If you remember the 6th plague, that the river Euphrates that support Babylon now dries up. So the political and secular powers that enable Babylon or the prostitute to dominate the world suddenly withdraw their support and turn against her. Why? Well, from the context of chapter 16, indicates most likely the deceived governing powers of the world become disillusioned. They are upset with Babylon's impotence to protect herself and the rest of the world from those bold plagues. So these secular powers united among themselves to withdraw their loyal support from her. In fact, they have turned their friendly support into hostility and hatred and bring her to her ruin. And furthermore, this disillusioned worldwide political powers will make Babylon desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. Wow, such hostility and hatred. One interesting observation. In the Old Testament, the punishment for the prostitute is usually death by stoning and not burning with fire. You can check that up in Deuteronomy chapter 22, 20-24, and also the Gospel of John chapter 8, verse 5. The burning with fire is reserved for the daughter of a high priest who was involved in prostitution. And you can check it in Leviticus 21:9. So the fact that the fate of the prostitute is stated in terms of burning by fire rather than stoning is again an indication that the women in chapter 17 is a religious entity and not a political entity. Also indicates that the once true faithful church has changed at the end time. It will become a power that opposes God and his faithful people. Verse 17. For God has put into their hearts to do his purpose and to do it with one mind. That is to give the kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. The angel explains that it was God who has brought about the destruction of Babylon. Unconsciously, the beast and this union of political power are carrying out God's purpose to bring judgment upon Babylon, or we call it the prostitute here. And this echoes Paul's statement in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 to 12. God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. So the truth is that God never loses control over human affairs. In the last analysis, God is always working things together for good. It is God who permits the end-time powers to come together to serve Babylon. Verse 18. And the woman whom you saw is the Greek city, which rules over the kings of the earth. Starting at this verse and the rest of chapter 18 is about the judgment of the prostitute, or of this religious system. John was told that this prostitute is the Greek city, which is Babylon. And the prostitute and the Greek city symbolizes the same anti-religious system that stands in opposition to God. Divine judgment is now set into motion against this anti-religious system. In summary, Revelation chapter 17 elaborates the motif of the drying up of the river Euphrates in the sixth plague, which causes the fall of anti-Babylon. If you remember, Euphrates River was the life source for ancient Babylon. The citizens depend on those water for drinking, for irrigation, and for their everyday use. And the first portion of chapter 17 identifies Babylon the Great as a seducing prostitute dwelling on many waters and riding on the resurrected beast of Revelation 13. And this religious system persecutes and oppresses God's people. Babylon has such dominating influence on the inhabitants of the earth because of the cooperation, because of the support of the governing secular and political power of the world. But then the ending is not happy. Revelation chapter 17, 14 to 17 said, the drying up of the Euphrates, which symbolized there'll be withdrawal of support of Babylon by the secular and political power of the world. And because they realized that they were being deceived, so they turn against Babylon and destroy it. Well, next week we're going to study more in chapter 18. Happy Sabbath.